Hello and welcome to this session. So in this session we're going to be looking at voice over IP, and this is how we basically send a human voice over IP networks, and this basically helps us to make calls over the internet. So if you're into this kind of content, remember to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and comment down below. Let me know what you think about this video and what other topics you'd like me to talk about in the future. So let's get into voice over IP. Now, in past years, we had separate networks for data traffic, voice traffic, video traffic, and this was due to the limitation of bandwidth in earlier days. And we basically had PBX, which would be the telephone switching system or the telephone network for sending voice traffic, and we would have IP1, which included the regular routers, switches, and other networking equipment in our networks, and those send data traffic. As we said, due to limitation of bandwidth, we had to separate this network, and PBXs would be used, and PBX stands for private branch exchange, which is a telephone system, and it is a privately owned telephone switching system. Now, these PBXs would be located in different branches, as the name suggests, and these PBXs would be connected from different branches using a tie line or a tie trunk, which would be paid for. Now, these tie lines would then be connected to a PSTN, which is a public switched telephone network, and it is a worldwide telephone system made up of interconnection of multiple telephone companies. Now, this would completely separate the network, and we would have a separate network for voice traffic and data traffic and video traffic, and basically, as the bandwidth limitation was eliminated by speed increase, then we would accommodate voice data traffic in one network, the IP1 network. So voice over IP was introduced, and the voice over IP was introduced to combine data, voice, and video traffic in the same network as IP1, like we just talked earlier, and this would reduce the leasing cost of tie lines that would connect different branches. Now, one would ask how we would incorporate voice traffic in IP1. Now, routers connected to these PBXs, you have to know the difference. In the PBXs, we use the tie line. In IP1, we use routers. So routers need to be in a position to connect to these PBXs and transport the voice traffic. Now, the routers would be connected to the PBX, and they could stream voice over a layer 4 protocol called the real-time transport protocol. And the real-time transport protocol is a layer 4 protocol encapsulated in UDP, and carries voice and video media streams. The ports that would connect the routers to the PBXs would be the foreign exchange station, the foreign exchange office, Ian Mouth, or Arden Magneto, the famous E1 and T1 ports. This was what would be used to connect these routers to the PBXs so that the voice traffic would be sent fluently. Now, let us look at how we digitize voice so that it's able to be sent over IP networks. And when we are talking about digitizing voice, we are basically referring to how we change spoken voice into a digital waveform, that is ones and zeros that can be understood by computers. And this is done by taking samples of our voice waveform. If enough samples are taken frequently and labeled, then sent over a network, the receiving device would be in a position to capture the labeled samples and rebuild the voice message sent over the network. Now, we have to be very careful, because if we took too many samples, then it would take up more bandwidth, and if too few samples were taken, then there would be a message distortion. You'd not have the entire message, you'd have a distorted message. Now, how do we determine the amount of samples that we need to take in order to recreate the waveform or the sound or the spoken voice that is sent over a network? Now, the samples taken every second are determined by the Nyquist theorem, which states that a waveform can be sampled and adequately reproduced from those samples if the number of samples taken per second is at least 2 times the highest frequency being sampled. Now, in the voice world, human voice occurs at less than 4000 Hz. That is the frequency for human voice. So if we were to follow the Nyquist theorem, then we would have to take 8000 samples in order to recreate a human voice. And this is commonly known as a pulse amplitude modulation, and which stands for pulse amplitude modulation, is an analog approach to encode a signal based on the amplitude of the samples taken. Now, this is what we call the pulse code modulation, and this is basically the approach of encoding a signal where a numeric value is assigned to the palm sample based on the amplitude of that sample. This is what we call the quantization noise, and this is the background noise present in the PCM. Since when you are drawing a graph, or when you are representing the waveform in a scale, then you would have some errors because the voice would vary. It would not exactly fit to a 1 or to a 2. It would be 1.2567 such, and this would bring the quantization noise. Now, a solution to reduce the quantization noise is to use a logarithmic scale rather than a linear scale, and a logarithmic scale is more accurate. You remember this from high school applications. Now, each sample taken from the waveform contains 8 bits, and the 8 bits would include one polarity bit, 3 segment bits, and 4 step bits. So if we were to take 8000 8-bit samples as a Nyquist theorem states, then we can digitize the voice, or transform the spoken voice into ones and zeros. So what we basically do is to take the human voice frequency, which is 4000 Hz, multiply it by 2 to get the amount of samples that you need to take, then divide the samples by the bit size, which is 8, and you're basically going to get 64 kilobits per second. That is the bandwidth that was available to send voice traffic over IP networks, and it has been used over a very long time. And this was borrowed from the old T1 circuit that connected to the PBX. It would connect the router to the PBX, and it had 24 separate channels. Each channel would accommodate 64 kilobits per second bandwidth. So you basically send the voice traffic over one of these channels. Now, a coder decoder, or a codec for short, is an approach for encoding the digital sound, which may or not be compressed. So codec is just a way for encoding the data, so that when you're sending it over a network, remember you need to encode or decode this voice traffic, so that you're able to send it over an IP network. Now, there are different standards that were used, the codec standards that are used when we are transmitting voice traffic over IP networks, and this would come with different bandwidths, and due to encapsulation and decapsulation of packets when you are transferring them over IP networks, then you'd have a bandwidth over the internet. So the bandwidth payload only represents when it is the voice is just sent without encapsulation packets, without encapsulating it, and the bandwidth of the internet includes the header information you added to the packet, or to the voice traffic, and this would maybe include the source IP address, the destination IP address, and such type of headers as we move along the IP network. Now, the G711 codec had a payload only bandwidth of 64 kilobits per second, but when you send it over Ethernet, you'd increase the size of the packet, and you'd have a bandwidth of 87.2 kilobytes per second. The G729 had 8 kilobits per second, and this would be basically compressed voice, and this would be used over wide area networks so that the traffic would reach further. Now, when you put it over Ethernet, the resulting bandwidth would be 31.2 kilobits per second, and these were the basic standards that were used earlier. Now, recently, there is what we call the ILBC, the Internet Low Bit Codec, and this basically comes to take over the two codec standards that were there earlier. And with the ILBC, payload bandwidth only would come at 13.3 kilobits per second or 15.2 kilobits per second, and the bandwidth over the Ethernet would range from 28.8 kilobits per second to 38.4 kilobits per second. And that is basically how we digitize a human voice or spoken voice into into digital waveform. And we basically said that we just take samples from the voice waveform, then we multiply it by 2 as Nyquist theorem suggests, then divide the resulting value by the number of bits or the bit length of the samples that need to be taken, that is 8. So we get 8000 divided by 8, we get 64 kilobits per second. Then this 64 kilobits per second would then be either compressed or decompressed and then sent over IP networks. So that's it when it comes to voice over IP. Thank you for joining me in this one. See you as we look at how we digitize video traffic. Thank you.